Ian, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm not too bad at all. Busy time for you at the moment.
Yeah, well, it's result season.
Yeah.
So the Q4 results. So, I mean, it's smack bang in the middle of it.
Yeah.
It's always a really busy time of year, plus everything else that's going on in the world. So you add the two together, it's like...
Keeping you busy. Well, thank you for carving out a little bit of time to come and speak to us in the meantime. So we wanted to talk about AI and its impact on media today, media and advertising, the industry sort of overall, sort of generally, and then maybe at a more precise level. One of the big stories that's been going on at the moment is OpenAI launching ads. OpenAI lost something like, I don't know the exact numbers, but something like £5 billion in 2024. They're obviously chasing a fairly big delta there. Do you think that they can make that up? And do you think ads are going to help with that? Or do you Mark Ritson's take was less positive? I don't know if you saw that in Adweek. He didn't necessarily think it was going to be the savior that they were looking for. But what's your take on that?
Well, I think they've set some pretty ambitious targets, and they have to. You bear in mind with OpenAI and the valuation, what they have to persuade investors is OpenAI is worth that much. So you have to come up with a big narrative. You have to come up with a big story. If you look at what Sam Altman talks about in terms of his comments about revenues getting to, I think it was several $100 billion of revenues by 2030. The annual increase in revenues, if you look at the sort of compounded annual growth rate, something like 95, 96%, sort of on that from where they are, that's a pretty big ask. Now, sort of if you go back a couple of years ago, everyone was thinking subscriptions. That would be the model that worked. What everyone has realized is that's really not going to push things. So, what the focus is now on advertising. And of course, everyone looks at the performance of the tech giants. They say they're continuing to grow strongly. They look at the pots of money that are still available in places like TV, $170 billion worth. Then what's in outdoor, what's in radio, et cetera, et cetera. And they're thinking that there's a sizable chunk of the market sort of that they can take there. I think one thing that we have to realize, and I will come to a one-line answer in a moment, is that we really do have two advertising markets. The way I always like to compare it is to an iceberg. There's the bit that's above the surface, which is the traditional advertisers, the Procter & Gamble's, the Unilevers, the ones that everyone think about. And then underneath is you have sort of the SMEs, which really are dominated by the online platforms. 80 to 85% of Google search and Meta revenues are probably from SMEs, and really where there's very little visibility on things. Now, sort of on my estimates, I reckon that the two are roughly equal in terms of size. And I think when we think about the advertising opportunity, what we tend to do is we tend to concentrate on the bit above the surface. But actually what's important to consider as well is the bit that's below as well, and therefore the entire market. And therefore, to come back to your question is, do I think that they can actually reach a point at which they can get that sort of meaningful profitability? I think it's unlikely. I always like to say, by the way, as usual, this is not investment advice, just in case.
I actually know you as that because you sign off every LinkedIn post as that. So,
I know.
So I'm seeing Ian Whittaker. This is not investment advice. Yeah, exactly. It's your catchphrase, right?
Yeah, I thought I better just mention it generally. I think it's unlikely that they will. However, you can see there's a path. Now, I think with the two advertising markets, what I would also say is this: the traditional advertising market has limits on its growth. If you actually look at what's happening in the SME advertising market and you look at what's happening with search results, I mean, Google came out with its Q4 results last night. You had Meta that came out sort of with their numbers of quite recently on that. It's going stronger than expected. And what you could argue is the SME market is maybe less sensitive in terms of things like pricing sensitivity than traditional advertisers. And I think if OpenAI can crack that, then there is a route where they can make a meaningful leap towards that target, but it still means they'd have to take considerable share from someone else. So my feel is unlikely, but I necessarily wouldn't rule it out 100%.
Okay. So I'm one of those SME businesses, and I was quite excited about the opportunity of testing OpenAI ads until they said that you have to have at least £200,000, in which case I thought probably ruled me out. Yeah. So I think they're thinking very much at the top of the iceberg to start with, aren't they? And Because there's not going to be many SME businesses that are going to go, yeah, we'll test you with £200,000.
Oh, absolutely not. And therefore, what it really becomes is more of a share game. Where do you take share from? Where do you take share of advertising budgets from? I think the interesting thing will be, if we think about what sort of categories sort of would make the most sense. Obviously, sort of search sort of would be the obvious one. Retail media, I think, sort of would be another one as well. But again, they have difficulties. Search is, I was a financial analyst back in the day when, if people remember the Yellow Pages, sort of I covered those stocks. Search is very much like that business model. But the point being with those classified directories and indeed search, the key point there is that if you are the market leader, you have a massive sort of advantage, because quite frankly, what you have is that you want advertisers who want one source of customers and customers who want one source of advertisers. They don't want to be going on 4 or 5 different sites to try and actually find the product that they want. And so I think with something like OpenAI, if that is the sort of market in which it's targeting, there's got to be a question of how much scale it will get. And therefore, if it doesn't get the scale, it's unlikely to take much in the way of ad revenues.
Yeah. Okay. So thinking about AI more generally then, had an interesting conversation with a CEO of an ad tech company recently where we were talking about how actually it might be that small businesses have a little bit of an advantage over bigger businesses. Now, obviously, they don't have the budgets, which is a disadvantage, but what they do have is the ability to iterate quickly and almost reimagine their entire business from the ground up using AI technology, whereas bigger companies will have legacy systems that are harder to just sort of switch off and sort of rebuild. So I just wonder what your take is on that. But like sort of on top of that question, if I may, like making it more sort of general around, making it more specific, I should say, around media and advertising is it feels like it's a very hard time for ad tech to innovate, certainly into the big media agencies, because they kind of are looking for fewer partners, not more. So it's quite a lot going on in that question, but I don't know what your view is on the small company advantage and how ad tech could maybe win using AI from the ground up.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very good point. If you look at sort of big companies, you talk about the legacy systems, and that's obviously sort of an issue. Really, what it's more around though is processes. These companies have structures. They have HR departments. They have sort of admin and payroll, et cetera, et cetera. Bringing AI into an organization, if you embrace it fully, can mean sort of transformational change. And whatever organizations talk about that they're willing to do that, very few in practice actually are. So my feeling is that actually with bigger organizations, where we'll see AI being used for, you'll get a few who definitely will look to transform the business. I think generally what you'll see them focus more on is more using it as an improving efficiency play on here. Now, that could be things such as, everyone's heard about sort of decreasing number of graduates being hired. So it could be in areas like payroll and for example, in terms of staff numbers, it could be in terms of processes. But I don't think for most organizations, AI will transform their businesses. With smaller businesses, of course, though, it's completely different. They don't have those structures. But also as well, bear in mind how bigger businesses have actually benefited sort of over smaller businesses. A lot becomes about scale. There is an element of the nobody ever got fired for using McKinsey's sort of line that comes through here as well. But all of it also boils down to knowledge. Larger companies have a large amount of knowledge that's locked within those companies and also as well access to outside it. Smaller companies generally don't. AI really transforms the rules as far as that goes, because if you are a smaller company, you can do things a hell of a lot quicker to market than you could do in the past, but also as well, you have access to far more information than you did previously. And that levels the playing fields between small and larger companies. And that sort of goes into the point about ad tech. If you think about sort of what ad tech is as its root, ad tech is, and I'm sure there will be some people on here who will disagree with it, but it's essentially the media buying and planning for the digital tech space. That's what it is. Digital ad space, simple as that. It is a it is a space that you could argue the agencies should have occupied 15 years ago. And that raises a question about their strategic decision making then. We'll put that to one side. Point is now is that the existing ad tech structure has been set very much upon process. And if you look what is probably the biggest barrier to change in the ad tech ecosystem, it is so complex and so intertwined. It's like the plumbing system that nobody can work out, and therefore nobody wants to touch, because you don't know if you change one thing, then what else is going to happen. Now, a product like AI doesn't reform that sort of system. Potentially, it can wipe it away, because potentially what you have is a product that essentially can just redesign everything that you thought, okay, the processes that have blocked us up before that have meant that it's very difficult to bypass the ad tech space suddenly become a lot more available. And I point out what's sort of happened in the past week or so in both the gaming sector and indeed the software sector. Both sectors have seen their share prices crash off the back of separate AI developments. One with sort of Genie 3.0 by Google, and the other one with what's happened with Claude in terms of legal software and so on. Yeah, things are advancing very, very quickly. And also as well, the amounts of money that are being thrown at AI sort of are going up exponentially. And to give you one example, Google, when it announced its Q4 results last night, the analysts were expecting 2026 capex to be around $115, $120 billion. The actual guidance that Alphabet gave, was $175 to $185 billion. Now, that's 50% above what analysts thought. I sort of worked as a Wall Street analyst, of City of London analyst. That sort of miss is incredible, right? It is absolutely staggering that investors can get it so wrong, or maybe the messaging was wrong or whatever. But the point being with that is that the amounts of money that are being thrown into this technology are far greater than what people expect. And therefore, the changes that we get coming through from it should be far more radical than you expect, and probably in a quicker amount of time than you can think of. So when it comes to the ad tech space, is it at risk from AI? Absolutely.
Okay. So people talk about, is this a bubble, and are we going to see companies get sort of, obviously no one wishes that, and no one wants companies to go out of business. But when you look at OpenAI, for example, my own little corner of the world, we started with OpenAI inside our business, and we trained everyone how to use it. And we thought, right, that's the platform we'll use. But we're now increasingly thinking, well, we probably need a 2-platform strategy just in case. Not that they're about to go out of business anytime soon, but do we have a risk of something that's inherently quite expensive to develop and having the servers and everything you need, that it needs so much investment to get it to the point where it's making enough money? Do you think we're going to see a consolidation in these LLMs where we'll essentially have 1 or 2 rather than 10 or whatever we've got at the moment?
I mean, that's possible over the medium term. I don't think over the short term. I mean, one thing I would say about a bubble was, harking back to my financial days, I was around during the 2000 dot-com crisis and the lead up to that. This has got very different elements to that crisis. The firms back then, quite frankly, didn't have the money. Their valuations were, they were very high, as they are indeed now. But the point being was that they didn't really have the cash flows. And essentially, it was a case that if somebody, pet food business put .com on it, sort of at the end of their name, then suddenly their valuation went up 10 times. I think we're in an entirely different sort of situation here. Google, Meta, Microsoft, Amazon, they are all companies who have access to significant amount of cash flow, and therefore they can continue to fund this. So we're no doubt in an arms race. I think it was looking in terms of a bubble and say which one would be the potential weak point within the market. Again, you'd have to say OpenAI, just simply because it doesn't have the necessarily funding of everyone else. And indeed, some of the sort of players who don't have a very strong backer who is willing to put in so much money. Having said that, what OpenAI has done a good job of doing, as far as its own sort of safety is concerned, is locking itself into the middle of an ecosystem. So quite frankly, if it goes down, potentially it's got the chances of bringing down sort of quite a few other players as well. And good from that standpoint, from their standpoint, not necessarily what happens with the market. But I don't think this bubble is ending anytime soon, which are famous last words. I think, the sort of the amounts of cash that are being put in, the willingness of companies to do that, and also as well, so far investors are saying, if you do show rewards for this spending, we will reward you. And that's what happened with Meta's share price. I think that will continue to fuel things. The one other thing I would say as well is we concentrate very much on the US, what's happening sort of in the American markets, but don't forget what's happening in China. Yeah, and indeed, those models, you again have got the online giants there, the Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and so forth. You've got the Chinese government, which is actively funding sort of AI developments. Both the US and China see AI as critical to the superpower race between the two of them. So there is a government backing that's coming through there. And what you could also argue as well, and this is exactly what happened with DeepSeek, so that if you remember there, when they came out with their model, suddenly it caused a crash in the share prices of Western companies, because the argument was there, LLMs is actually overspending. Yeah, are there cheaper ways? And the Chinese are going down this route where they're developing they are focusing more on cheaper ways to actually develop AI. And if that model proves to be more effective, then again, there's going to be a big question mark over the strategy of what the major giants are doing. But at the moment, we're looking at things, I don't necessarily see I don't see this as a bubble that's about to pop. But as I say, that may be famous last words.
Yeah, there's not going to be a storm coming up, as Michael Fish once said. Yeah. They had the biggest storm in 30.
Well, yeah, hopefully it's not like that.
Yeah, fingers crossed. So what would be your best case view on how media will improve, or media and ad tech will improve with AI? And what would be your more bleak view of what could happen sort of in the medium term?
Well, I think it's quite interesting because, going back to what I said before about the iceberg, that you have advertising spend, which is above the line and or above the surface and below the surface. The below the surface part is dominated by the online tech giants. The problem has always been for traditional media players is they were not set up to access that market. Yeah, historically, that market was accessed by the regional newspapers and the directory stocks. And of course, those two lines of businesses, that money is effectively transferred over into the online space. The reason why those companies weren't set up was again, they thought, fine, we don't need to go after that market. We've got the traditional big advertisers. We can monetize that. Now, what AI does allow them to do, and actually just to step back a moment, why is it that they can't target SMEs? Quite frankly, they haven't got the resources. To actually go after contact SMEs, self-serve, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
The sales process is too long, isn't it?
Exactly. Right. And they're not set up for it. AI potentially transforms that equation. If you can get a process by which anyone can set up an app, and the cost and the ease of setting up the relevant software and applications, the cost of that plummets, which it is doing at the moment, then suddenly it becomes a lot easier for the traditional players to try and access the SME market. And indeed, that's what we're seeing. Look, last year, ITV, Channel 4, Sky all came together, said we're targeting SME ad market. You look at what WP is talking about, trying to target the SMEs and so forth. Now, will they succeed? We'll just have to wait and see. But the big opportunity there is that for roughly 50% of the market, the traditional media players can come in and compete with the online giants. Yeah. And obviously for the online giants, that's not great. The flip side of that, in terms of what's the apocalypse scenario, is that quite frankly, what happens is across the board, the traditional media industry loses its place. So agencies wiped out, because what happens is effectively they make most of their profits, depending on the group, from media buying and planning, which at the end of the day is a process more than anything else. If that could be automated, if, as Mark Zuckerberg said, give me your credit card, and I will do your ads from start to finish. Why do you need an agency? If that can create its ads. the television industry is, quite frankly, AI-generated content starts to take a meaningful share of our audience. Yeah, and people say, I don't really care whether it's real or not. Yeah, it's just about, actually, is it content I can watch? In which case, again, why do you need traditional broadcasters? And this all sort of boils down to a case that, yeah, the traditional media industry has effectively been, it's too strong a word maybe, but has been built on elitism. It's been built on the whole idea that essentially some content is more sort of is superior to others. Some audiences are superior to others. One of the defining features, which is not often mentioned about what's happening with AI, but also talk about the attention economy and so on, is that what we're getting the push for, particularly from the online giants, is the view that, all content is equal. All audiences are equal. It doesn't matter whether they're prime time or, all that really matters is share. Yeah, and that's about it. Sort of content, it doesn't really matter whether you watch sort of a NFL final or World Cup game, or you're watching an AI-generated slop. That's really one of the big sort of ideological battles that's happening very much under the surface at the moment. And where that goes will really sort of define what we see happening with the sort of whether the traditional media industry hangs on and indeed can thrive, which I would argue it actually can, sort of with, and AI gives it the chance to do so. Or what you find is essentially it becomes the online giants eat up your traditional media industry. Because make no bones about it, we come back to money. Money drives, sort of, is the ultimate decision maker in this game. These online platforms are spending so much money that they have to justify to investors the return on that spend. If they cannot justify that spend, their share prices will get decimated off the back of their spending. Yes, they can grow some of that organically, but a large part of that is really having to take it from somebody else.
Yeah. It's really, you talked there earlier about less price sensitivity in the SME market, which I think is 100% right. If you're going through one of the big agencies and you're P&G, Unilever or whatever, there's certain benchmarks that you're going to hit, and it's very hard to sort of change that. But how do we solve the sales problem in SME? Because that's been, since we talked about that, that's kind of been rattling around in my head there. Because, like, for example, that we work with a couple of ad platforms that would enable a very small company to be on the Guardian, the Telegraph, the Independent or whatever, but just in the couple of miles around where they do business. And they would love that. I'm sure they would, because they'd be like, oh my goodness, like, we've never had access to such premium elite kind of media. But it's the sales problem of going door to door to these companies to be able to open that up to them. So I think Quantcast do this a little bit, where they try to open up a platform. It's a self-serve platform where they allow anyone, like small businesses, to buy, but then it's still really difficult for them to get that in front of enough people to scale it, right? So I wonder if there's a way that AI can somehow help us. I don't know, that there's definitely something there, that there's this huge bit under the iceberg that you talked about, where there's a lot of money being spent, which is a lot of Meta's revenue comes from that, right? And Google and the like. But it's just too difficult to service it from a sales point of view for the Telegraphs and the Guardians of this world.
And certainly in terms of the technical side of things, self-serve process, how it's done, etc., AI can help. Quite frankly, though, I think the biggest help that traditional media platforms can do is, and it's the ultimate irony, is actually sort of go to brand advertising. The reason why SMEs don't think of TV companies or any of these groups is, quite frankly, because they just don't appear in their mind, on their radar screen.
Too expensive. They're considered too expensive, out of their reach, right?
Exactly. Right? You need to change that perception. I mean, this is a traditional branding campaign. If you are one of those now, obviously you need to have a product you can sell on there, but you can at least start to do some of the legwork when it comes to that. And I think, this is one thing that I would say generally about the media industry. I mean, again, sort of, I look at it from the outside because advertising is not my background. But for an industry that's actually built on, trying to persuade people to buy goods and services, and talks about the need for long-term brand building and trust and so forth, It's absolutely terrible at marketing itself. Horrendous. Okay.
Jobless children have no shoes, is the old saying.
Exactly. And it's exactly sort of this. And I think for this sort of thing to succeed, I think the risk would be is what they focus on is they focus on the technical details. They focus on getting a self-serve platform right, everything like that. And what they forget to focus on is, in the first case, you've really got to get people to actually know you and trust you. Now, certainly with TV companies, they have an advantage. People already know them and they trust them. But still, their target customer base has to be aware of a service that they're offering. So I don't think it's as difficult as what, sometimes seems, but it probably does require, I think it's really, it's sort of a mixture of things, this is one of those situations where several of situations or several factors come together. Yeah, it's understanding your target customer, obviously. It's also understanding the financial dynamics, understanding the timing, and also as well understanding the strategy of what you're trying to do. And that's, there's an argument for saying that much of the media industry hasn't been particularly great at doing that over the past 20, 25 years.
Yeah. I remember the QR code being quite a good example of that. You couldn't see a sales or marketing deck without a QR code in it when they first came out. They were even printing them on posters in the underground when there was no internet, like they were obsessed with them, but no one told the consumer what this thing was. And until COVID came around, and then suddenly it was on, everything was like distancing. And if you scan this, there was literally people in my local pub showing you, right, this is a QR code. If you scan this with your phone, it brings up the menu. And then suddenly the adoption went through the roof because, that's what it is. Like we forgot to tell the people that really needed to use it, what it was and how to use it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, look, ThinkBox has done some great work on this in the past, but there is a disconnect between sort of the media industry in terms of what it thinks and what it thinks the general population thinks and does, and actually what the general population does. And it's one of the things that, I've talked about this this before, but the agencies have got, I would say, much of the advertising industry has got too obsessed in process. Talks endlessly about measurement, attribution, the metrics. I'm a historian by background. Some of your listeners have probably heard me say this already, but much of the debate they hear within the advertising industry always reminds me of sort of when I was studying history and reading about the medieval theologians who would argue about how many angels you can fit on a pinhead. It's that sort of almost in a way, of minutiae that really at the end of the day doesn't count. But the industry has very much focused on that. Whether that's because it's comfort and it can't answer the bigger questions, whether there's for other reasons, or obviously of a lot of people who make a lot of money from
accountability.
Indeed, with that, but it needs to bring itself out. The world is changing. One thing I'd say about because I also as well talk about what's happening in the macroeconomic environment and so forth. But one thing that we're seeing at the moment is the world is changing from a world of how I would describe it as a process-driven world to a results-driven world. It is not about how you can make things more efficient. It's about what you can actually get things done. And I think the media industry really has to realize that and go along with it.
So that's Zuckerberg's point that give me a credit card and I'll sort it out. Don't worry about the process. I've got all that.
Exactly. That is from a strategic standpoint, Mark Zuckerberg has nailed it on the head. One of the things about the online platforms is they are absolutely superb when it comes to the idea of strategy and the execution of strategy. They understand it, they understand its role, and they understand that you have to have a properly defined strategy before you can execute properly. Again, and it's one of the reasons why these platforms have managed to gain as much share as they have done.
Cool. So just to finish off then, what do you think the year ahead looks like for the media and advertising world? What do you think is going to change? What can you see coming? Obviously, this is not investment advice.
Thank God for that. plus chance would probably be the best way of describing it. In a lot of ways, I don't think sort of much will change. Yeah, what do I mean by that? Well, I think we will continue to have healthy advertising growth in 2026. Yeah, I think that's a given, particularly as you've got events such as the World Cup, so that are very much in place. So I think the ad market will continue to be strong. I don't think there'll be any seismic shifts in terms of share. I don't think, for example, search will collapse because of AI. I think TV will have a reasonably okay year, again, because of things such as the World Cup. The other platforms as well, so out-of-home audio will do fine. And I'm sure, again, the likes of Meta will do okay as well. I don't think YouTube will overtake TV. In fact, that whole YouTube is TV argument, very good piece in the Wall Street Journal arguing YouTube is continuing sort of to come up against a buffer persuading CFOs that it should take TV ad money. So if we think about some of the...
Yeah, pulling out a bar probably didn't help with that, did it?
Well, probably, yeah. Maybe not the right signal, depending on your point of view. Although, again, they had their arguments for doing so. So, so I think on that front, you look at the market, you say, I don't think there's going to be any seismic shifts within the, what happens there. But I think what we will see is that we will see the foundations been laid for what could be potentially transformational change coming in the next 24, 36 months. And reason why sort of think, and that could be either good or bad for the industry, what we discussed before about positive case scenario, a negative case scenario. The fact that you've got so much money being spent on AI, and that again is going to significantly increase in 2026. There's always a lag effect between technology, the spend on technology, and the results that it produces. But if you look at already, as I said before, what's happened in the past week, games industry, software industry, information industries, their share prices all getting hit by developments coming out of AI. That could multiply over the next 18, 24 months. And I suspect it probably will. So I think those sorts of developments will go on. We obviously get to hear about things such as Netflix and Warner Brothers and the fight for that. So that will occupy a lot of the time in 2026. Probably doesn't, again, not much change in 2026 itself, sort of off the back of that. I do think we're likely to see more consolidation coming through in the European broadcasting space. So do expect that. And I think, again, one of the things that both AI and the Trump administration, I think from a European standpoint, is sort of really accelerating is the idea there has to be consolidation in the European media space. And so I think you will see a lot of change that comes through there. But if I was to say what could be a gray swan that could unpick things, I'd go back to what I said at the beginning, that the investors lose faith in OpenAI, and that has a ripple effect that comes throughout the whole AI sort of and media and tech industries. I don't think it will derail AI, but obviously given how much OpenAI has been at the heart of everything, I think that would be the gray swan that I would look out for. There's one other factor I would say as well, which again is going to be sort of important for the advertising industry. I have a research product. I call it bigger picture. The reason why I call it the bigger picture is to say that you need to understand what's happening in the wider macroeconomic, geopolitical trends, etc., to really understand what's going to happen in sort of the media and tech space. Things, I won't use an expletive, but things travel downwards and so forth. And if you don't have that, then you risk getting blindsided. The one thing sort of would remind people is 2026 is the midterm elections in the US. Donald Trump is determined, yet more so than ever, to actually make sure that sort of he retains control of Congress. Now, the reason I mentioned that is, what is the number one issue for Americans at the moment? Affordability. How does that actually sort of manifest itself in terms of complaints? Rising prices. What does that mean in terms of many firms? They're going to be under pressure in terms of the price increases they can put through. So I think in that environment, I think there is a very important role for brand to play in terms of helping to support consumers. And in fact, I was at Lead this morning. Yeah, the last presentation of the day was actually how BBH had helped Tesco's sort of advertise through the pandemic. It's that sort of thing that advertisers are going to have to be aware of as well. Because again, if voter backlash against prices comes to the point where you get politicians demanding that firms cut their prices, and that's already happening, by the way. Yeah, there was a very interesting email that came out from the daily White House email that came out yesterday. One of the things it, pardon the phrase, or the pun rather, it trumpeted was that Pepsi had cut sort of prices on items such as Doritos by up to 15%. That was coming out with the administration's sort of email address, and they're claiming credit for it.
Right.
There's going to be a lot more of this sort of pressure on firms, particularly in the US. And bear in mind, US firms and its corporate profitability that drives advertising spend, it's the most important determinant. And most of that spend is driven by US firms who are headquartered in the US.
It's hardly a staple, Doritos, is it? I'm thinking, really, they've focused on that. Yeah, like not bread or milk.
Well, they're focusing on all these things. I mean, the point being is that if there is sort of political pressure sort of on firms to cut prices, that again is potentially another effect, sort of a left field effect that could also come through as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Ian, thank you so much for your time. Much appreciated. I know you're super busy, so thanks for popping in.
Not at all.
Thanks for being on the podcast. Appreciate it.
That's why, Mike.